Beginning in the 1840s, Chinese men left their homeland in the Guangdong province to come to the United States in search of new opportunities. They had a dream of a better life. During this period, China suffered from rebellion, social disorder, war, foreign invasion, poverty, and famine. It was difficult to leave home, but they had a long tradition of leaving China for trade and work. One destination was California's gold fields, or Gumsan, Gold Mountain.
Originally, the Chinese came here from China to work in the gold mines. There was great unrest in China at that time. There had been famine. They were having the opium wars were going on there. It was a lot of unrest. So what happened is that Chinese men came here to America. Mostly they were drawn by the gold rush. They came here to make their fortune, and then they were going to go back to China.
Because of their experience and success, they were resented, overtaxed, and like most non-Anglo miners, finally excluded from the gold mines. Skilled, resilient, and enterprising, the Chinese found other employment such as construction, fishing, farming, retail, and international trade.
Father's family was a little bit better than the average Chinese family because my grandfather was a kung fu master. He taught kung fu in the town called Norfu, N-O-R-F-U. I don't know where that is, but it's in southern China. And my dad was born in 1860. He came to the United States either in his late teens or early 20s.
My father came from a village up in the hills. It was Samzhouhang is the Cantonese pronunciation for it. And my mother came from a village probably at the foot of the hill, and that was Cha-Yin-Chin. And that is really close to where Sin Yat-sen comes from. It's the next village over.
My father came from Canton. He came from Hoi Ping, and the name of the village is Malgong. He came here with an uncle to Fresno, California, and went to a technical high school and worked in one of the markets in Fresno.
My grandfather's name was Lai Chu Yi. He was born in 1883 in San Francisco, California. We don't know much about his parents, but from what my family oral history was that my great-grandfather probably went to California to pan gold.
What we see is that there's a progression of types of people that came. First maybe fishermen or merchants, and then further along people would come and farm. They would come and try to do business there and set up their thing. And I think if you take some of those things out of that frontier progression and you put it in California, you can see the same things happening. The first people that came over probably had some money and they were merchants. Some of them even came in their own boats.
He came here on a junk. They crossed the ocean on a junk. And I don't really know what happened to the ship or anything of that.
My great-grandfather was the first to go to Hawaii in around 1870. Both my mom and my dad's parents came from China. My great-grandfather came across on a rice boat and formed a construction company in Honolulu after the plague. He was able to make his fortune because, as you know in history, Chinatown burnt down because of the bubonic plague in Hawaii, and no one would help rebuild Chinatown.
It was said in the West that the Pacific leg of the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in Utah in 1869, was built on tea, that is, by Chinese labor.
He worked for the railroad, which paid him $1 a day from sunup to sundown, and out of that $1 a day, he paid 25 cents for 3 meals of rice. And the money that he made, he sent back to his home, and they managed to buy more land and built a new home.
They witnessed the first trains that connected Santa Barbara and Ventura. Mm-hmm. And they sometimes went by train, didn't they?
They had
to
friends.
visit some friends in Santa Barbara. And they came to visit Grandma and our mother too.
And I understand that my grandmother believed that some of the ghosts of the people who had died building the railroad were extending their hands asking for rice. So my mother had a little apron, and in the apron was a pocket, and my grandmother put some uncooked rice, raw rice, and scattered it out the window to feed the hungry spirits.
No picture of Western expansion is complete without the Chinese. The city called San Buenaventura grew up around the Spanish mission that had been placed among the ancient Chumash in 1782. This Victorian city was incorporated in 1866. It's not known how long the Chinese had been there, nestled close to the center of town, between the mission and the sea, along Figueroa from Maine to Santa Clara. They were first mentioned by newcomer Thomas Bard, who observed them in a July 4th celebration back in 1865.
The famous thing that's always quoted is Bard's letter to his brother, one of the Bard to the other Bard, in 1866, that talks about he saw some celestials or Chinese in the 4th of July parade.
Well, after they settled in San Francisco for a while and grandfather learned how to cook, then they went to Ventura, where job opportunities were greater.
Well, China Alley slowly evolved, and no one really knows how it came to be. Essentially, that was the older part of town near the old mission, and the lands at that point in history had been kind of overlooked by the newcomers, the Yankees. So land was cheap there.
My mother's house was on Figueroa Street, opposite the Ventura Mission, and it was a row of wooden houses. I think houses were made of wood, and
yes, that was the Chinese community at that time.
The Chinese were not planning on staying. Many built temporary sorts of housing, using as little wood as possible. Little by little, this evolved into its own separate community.
China Alley was the nucleus of the Chinese community. Chinese farmers and farm workers, chuck wagon cooks, construction workers, domestics from all over Ventura County, and Chinese travelers passing through could find a microcosm of Chinese society. Around the 1880s, Chinese families began to inhabit the community.
My mother told about buying milk from a family that owned some cows. Two cows. And she would take a pail and buy milk from that family near the ocean. And she would bring it home, and Grandma would boil it and put a piece of ginger in it. And she and my mother would drink it. And then my mother also ran errands to Dick Perano's store opposite the church to buy coffee or sugar.
There was a perpendicular alley that was there, and in 1890 there were 28 addresses in the Chinese community according to a Sanborn map. And recently we found a hand-drawn map in the National Archives from 1894 which described the businesses that were in the Chinese community. And these included several businesses, and they included merchants, merchant contractors, grocers. There were also the Bing Kong Tong. There was the Chinese Fire Company, there were residents, there was a kitchen, and it also showed gambling, opium, and prostitution establishments in the community.
Within this community, many services were provided. One could get a letter written or read. Find out the latest local and international news. Visit a doctor and get herbs, get a haircut, eat a home meal, or find a job.
There were stores and places where men would find work. They would be standing outside the store, and then the people who enlisted the workers would come by and take them in their cars or horse wagons to the place of work.
There were laundries, of course, that met the needs of the Yankee population. There were 5 of them. There was several stores which also operated as employment agencies. They were the middlemen who hired the gangs of laborers. There were also sleeping quarters where these laborers could come and for a modest price find a berth, someplace to sleep and stay until they went on to their next job.
Grandfather was a cook on the wagons that traveled with the workers to harvest the wheat. And they went from one farm to another.
You could make pancakes and cake and I guess American food.
Yes,
I guess.
three meals a day.
3 meals a day. He got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, I understand, to prepare so that they could eat and get to working by 6. So it was a long day for him, I think.
We have evidence in the city of Ventura in the 1870s that a group of Chinese were hired to dig a water canal.
Sam Fong Yi, who later leased land along the Santa Clara River in El Rio, had a store, restaurant, and a labor agency. Ung Hing was another resident of the Chinese community who was prosperous and influential. He was the head of a store on Figueroa Street named Sing Hing and Company. He was invested in additional enterprises in Santa Barbara, Mexico, and Hong Kong. He was best known for his preservation of the Ortega adobe. Tom Lim Yan was one of the most important members of Ventura's Chinese community.
Tom Lin Yan was one of the earliest merchants that we found to date in Ventura County. And he had a store in the Chinese community in Ventura. He was an interpreter in court cases. He also was an employment contractor. And he was a letter writer where he would write letters to the federal government for his countrymen. And he also had a school. In 1878, we have an account of him having a school in Ventura where he taught his countrymen how to read and write English. He was also reported to be a scholar, that he was highly educated and respected by the host community in Ventura. And in 1909, after achieving success in America, he went back to China.
The Chinese took every opportunity for education by also attending English classes offered by the American Home Missionary Society, established in 1889. Missionary women would visit the homes of the wives of Chinese merchants and their children. These missionaries would use Montgomery Ward's catalogs as imaginative teaching tools.
They had missionary ladies come and teach them the alphabet and simple, reading and spelling and so on. Okay. The children didn't go to the American schools, so they didn't mix with the children.
Ventura's Chinese population changed after the turn of the century. With the modernization of Ventura's downtown area, the east side of Figueroa was removed, while the west side remained under the ownership of Ung Hing. Approximately 100 Chinese settlers moved west on Main Street, close to the avenue. Some men returned to China, while others migrated to the Oxnard Plain to work in the sugar beet industry. The unique and famed Chinese Fire Company was reported to be established during the 1870s and later maintained in Ventura by 2 community leaders, Sam Fong Yi and Tom Lim Yan. It served China Alley and the surrounding commercial and residential neighborhoods pro bono. Buildings in this 19th century environment were constructed of wood, and residents in the Chinese community were concerned that the local fire department, the Monumentals, would not respond to a fire in Chinatown.
There would be gongs that sounded or some kind of signal, and Grandpa held the keys to the garage or to the barn where the fire
truck was
truck was held. And of course it was hand-drawn, and they would go immediately to the place of the fire, and sometimes even before the American firemen arrived.
We're not quite sure what happened to the fire company and the hose cart and all of that in Ventura, but we do know that a fire company started up in Oxnard. So it's very possible that the hose cart and the firefighters moved to Oxnard.
If there's a big fire, they needed young men to volunteer as firemen. And they would connect this apparel to the automobile, and they would whiz it to where the fire was. I remember when the Oxnard Hotel was burning, they said the Chinese helped quench the fire.
I remember a broken down shack that we just looked at, and there was a broken down, fire thing that looked like it was drawn by people rather than motorized or anything, and it disappeared.
I remember him taking me down to right next to City Hall. The fire department had a Chinese fire truck, and was told at that time that the Chinese had organized this fire brigade and had used this truck, and it was one of the first that was in Oxnard.
Chinese Lunar New Year starts with a new moon on the first day of the new year and ends 15 days later.
Well, I remember on New Year's Eve at midnight, Mother would wake us all up, and we would all participate in a meatless meal.
In the evening, they would be sent to bed around the normal 8 or 9 o'clock, but at 12, the children were awakened and they put on all their pretty clothes and finery, and they would eat special little delicacies, and I guess it would be firecrackers.
On the first day of New Year, it was meatless. He said to give the fowls, the animals, a day of peace. We don't eat meat, we just had vegetable and tofu and the rice.
Actually, you celebrated it as far as the New Year itself, is that you had a dinner the day before and the day after New Year's, and the day of New Year's was supposed to be a day of inactivity.
They would clean the house.
Oh yes, clean the house.
Especially the kitchen. And then they would also burn incense. And worship. To give thanks to the gods for a good year.
If anything happened on Chinese New Year's, why, it would happen for the rest of the year, so my mother never opened for business on that day. And she believed that you were going to, spend money during the year, why, you had to spend it on that day, so she always went shopping that day.
I remember one occasion, it was Chinese New Year, and we all the Chinese children stayed home. But the truant officer, a lady cop, came and got all of us. She had a four-door car with open air, no. She herded us all in and took us all back to school that day.
Bill says in those days, everybody he meets up with in Chinese New Year would give him a lacey, which is lucky money, And he says, I could collect quite a bit, All I had to do was run around and say hello to everybody and Happy New Year, and I was sure to get, lucky money on the thing.
I understand that some Chinese believe that the kitchen god reported to the god above about how the family treated each other, and tell them about the condition of the family.
There's a common myth in California history that Chinese communities were entirely bachelor societies. However, several Chinese families resided in Ventura County. The earliest family documented in Ventura is the Yi family. The patriarch, Yi He, arrived with his wife and daughter in the early 1880s. By 1895, the family had grown to include 4 children: Emily, William, George, and Nellie. One woman in the community took it upon herself to teach the young Chinese girls manners.
Well, after grandmother died, my mother and the 2 younger brothers continued to live in Ventura. And there was a lady named Lin Feng who lived nearby, who went to visit the Yi family, and then she tried to teach the girls good manners.
She's very critical.
What did she say?
She said, girls must walk one step at a time and speak one word at a time, not be rushing around or speaking too fast. And so you want to say it in Chinese?
Nuôi choi hàng lu yết bu wa nuôi choi gong sư mun yết gui wa means is that right? You see?
Or do you hear me? So my mother said that they were not particularly fond of this lady being so critical of them.
But my mother remembered that all the rest of her life, and told us what she heard from this woman.
There were 2 wives of merchants who lived in the Chinese community in Ventura. Mrs. Suhu Bok, known as Minnie, was married to a prominent merchant who had a store on Main Street. Together, they had 5 children. After the untimely death of their parents, the children were orphaned at a young age. Entrepreneur Ang Hing celebrated his marriage to Suhu Chong Ti with 4 days of festive celebration in January 1896. After the wedding, they lived behind the Sing Hing and Company store on Figueroa Street. They had 2 adopted children, Willie and Mabel. The Ung family moved to Oxnard in 1905.
A group of people, strangers in a strange land, viewed almost as we might view aliens from another planet by the Yankees and even the Latin population.
Their lifestyle was very different than what was common in a Victorian era. So they didn't really assimilate. They were pretty much here just to make money and go back home. So they didn't really interact with the host community that much. So they maintained their traditional clothing, maintained their traditional religions, their traditional foods, all of that. So when the economic times got difficult, they were seen as being very foreign, and there was a big movement to exclude them. There was also a lot of violence towards the Chinese in California as well.
The Chinese Exclusion Law Act of 1882 was the first law passed by the Congress of the United States that actually targeted a specific ethnic group. In this case, it's the Chinese workers in the United States. And what they did was they passed a law stating that if you are not one of the following classes, merchants, diplomats, students, if you're not one of those classes, if you're a laborer in the United States and you're originally from China, if you ever go back to visit your relatives, your family in China, then you cannot come back to the United States again.
It wasn't a situation where the people were deported. It was that the laborers were no longer allowed to come in. So there was a definite category of laborers.
Just the very fact of being Chinese was cause enough for people to be mean to them, and also in some cases be physically abusive to them. So I think, it's a very stressful situation.
The Chinese were not allowed to testify in court, buy land, marry outside of their ethnicity. They were denied bail in habeas corpus proceedings, unable to become a citizen, and prohibited from several occupations.
Every one of these unjust laws were challenged in court by the Chinese. The Chinese believe in the American legal system. They hired attorneys who were Euro-Americans and helped them to argue the cases in court. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was passed largely because the Chinese would make scapegoats by the politicians. The economy wasn't doing very well at the time, and the politicians wanted to blame someone. And the Chinese are easy targets because they have no voting rights. And until then, the Chinese really has no status whatsoever in the United States.
Irish immigrant Dennis Kearney, leader of the Workmen's Party in San Francisco, came into prominence by ranting and raving against Chinese workers. His campaign motto was, "The Chinese must go." An anti-Chinese league was formed in Ventura and had regular meetings at Union Hall. Newspapers announced that all citizens were invited, while brass bands provided entertainment. Guest speakers such as Professor Buchanan and W.E. Shepard addressed the assembly.
There was a very persistent prejudice that the Chinese had to face in those early years. Fortunately, the depth of hatred wasn't as deep in Ventura as it was in other locations, but it did exist. And there were stories of Chinese being stoned by children, defamatory things said about them, things of that nature. That did exist, so things were not bucolic.
Local newspapers carried articles and editorials complaining about the evils of the Chinese population. There were continual pleas for the suppression and elimination of the Chinese workforce and the cleaning up and removal of Chinatown. The general sentiment of the host community was summed up in the Ventura Free Press in 1886. We are nothing these days if not anti-Chinese.
Unfortunately, none of the labors by the Chinese in opening up the West, in constructing the transcontinental railroads, and also opening up the farming and irrigation communities, so on, in California were ever given credit, because the politicians deemed that we need to focus on the Chinese being a negative influence rather than a positive contribution to this country.
Many Chinese laborers moved to Oxnard at the turn of the century to work for the sugar beet factory that was established in 1899.
Every afternoon, the whistle would blow, and we know what time. And same as 6 o'clock in the evening, it'll blow again.
At that time, there were 253 Chinese in the area, and 153 of them were laborers. So it was farm labor that they were involved in early on.
As a child, the whole class went through the sugar factory. And all the sugar that was coming out, we could put our hand out and get a handful.
They were farming in Oxnard, in the Oxnard area. They were farming in Saticoy. They were farming in Ventura. They were farming in that area. Oxnard, as you know, it's like it used to be a really rich, it's an alluvial plain. It's a really great ground. And so, you know, the Irish came in there and farmed, the Germans came in there and farmed, the Chinese, they were farming there too.
So I think early on, that was their big role here, was to be part of the whole agricultural industry. That was the largest labor category. The second largest labor category in 1900 were cooks. They were cooks. They were either cooks in homes, cooks in restaurants, farm cooks.
They farmed out here in Camarillo on the Broom Ranch. They farmed on F Street in Oxnard when it was out in the country. So this community grew up around, they were in Oxnard before the community started, so they were a very integral part of from the get-go of the Oxnard community. Right at Oxnard Boulevard there and 5th Street, right at that corner, the beachside corner, not the Camarillo side, but this side, between 5th Street and 6th and 6th Street on Oxnard Boulevard. That's your first Chinatown. In fact, the map says Chinese quarters.
A Chinatown was established around 1900 and consisted of one city block. This Chinese community was made up of stores, employment agencies, laundries, restaurants, gambling establishments, the Bing Kong Tong, and the Chinese Fire Brigade. An alley ran through the center of this block, thus giving the area the name China Alley. One of the earliest Chinese merchants in China Alley was Yi Sing and Yi Young. In 1902, these men bought land and owned the Kwangchung Company, located at 724 A Street.
When I was growing up, Oxnard was known as a Suhu town. Yes. It seemed that every other adult was a Suhu, but we got along very well. Everybody was friendly and neighborly.
There were several Suhu men who had businesses in Oxnard's Chinese community.
I remember there's a Mr. Suhu. His name was Dun At, younger uncle. Everybody was a younger uncle, mostly because my dad, we go by my dad's age, and my dad was way up there. Older uncle were few, but everybody was a younger uncle. He was very friendly. Everybody depended on him for interpretation. He could speak a few words of English, and he was a very friendly man.
I have read oral histories where there were people that did go into the Chinese community, but in some cases people were afraid. They were afraid to go into the Chinese community because it was different. You know, they spoke a different language there, they dressed differently, and in Oxnard it was considered the red light district.
The Golden Chicken Inn was established by Hall Suhu in 1928 with 6 partners. Mr. Suhu ran the restaurant until 1965.
But I remember that 7th Street, 8th Street, 7th Street, the Golden Chicken Inn, that corner at Boulevard, and the 8th Street, the other side, the bakery. You know, they bake bread and it tastes real, you know, so delicious.
I remember sending my boy there to get bread, and they in the afternoon they always have French bread, which was delicious.
Oh, and then there's still some Chinese farming. They plant vegetable by Chinese people.
He took over a vegetable farm where we grew vegetables. And I remember one occasion he also had raised potato in a residential lot.
Although primarily male-oriented, China Alley was the home to a few Chinese families. One of the earliest families found in Oxnard's Chinese community was the Sem family. Tom Matoy and Sam Him, who were both born in China, had 5 children. The oldest, Charlie, was born in China, while Daisy, Annie, Sue, and Harry were born in Oxnard. Daisy was born on April 11, 1911, in China Alley.
My father worked for a rancher called Jack Hill, and at that time he told my dad, any lot in Oxnard you can buy for $500, and told my dad if he wanted to buy, if there's any trouble, he would help. But my dad didn't have that much money to invest in property. I remember going there one morning with my dad, and the lady must have asked my dad if I could go into her house. And he said yes. So she took me into her house, sat me on the kitchen stool, and first she had me wash my hand. I was grumpy for playing in the potato field. And then she took out a loaf of bread, she sliced a piece, and spread jam on the bread and gave me a glass of milk and told me for me to snack on it. And after that, she gave me a little blue-eyed, blonde-haired doll. That was very nice of her. And she said, "Can you say thank you, Mrs. her name?" And I said that, yes. I told her thank you, Mrs. whatever her name was, bless her. And then she told me I could go out and join my dad. That was my first act of kindness, you know, for an immigrant daughter to be given a doll.
During its 45 years of existence, approximately 200 to 600 men lived in Oxnard's Chinese community. After the Great Depression, the Chinese community began to decline. As part of a modernization process in the 1940s and 50s, buildings in China Alley were removed. By 1960, there were 60 people of Chinese descent remaining in Oxnard.
There were so few of us that we saw one person that resembled some type of Asian. It didn't matter if it was Chinese or Japanese, we'd go out and shake their hands. So the first thing we did is we said, is there a Chinese restaurant around here? And there was this place called Mama Suhu's on Oxnard Boulevard.
A family arrived in Oxnard in 1920 and opened a general store. Suhu Young Hall, or Mama Suhu, and her husband, Suhu Yi Tom, had 6 children.
My sister Irene was the first child in our family to be born in Oxnard, and she was born in 1920. So I know that that's sometime before then we moved to Oxnard.
Bill was born in 1924. He was born when his father was 72, and his father had came over from China quite a bit earlier. He was a junk ship captain.
He did work on the railroad, and he was a farmer and a merchant. That he married my mother rather late in life.
He opened a shop in China Alley, and it was a general store at first.
Since he was born in I think 1853, that would have made him a teenager when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and an adult when Custer had his last stand.
Suhu Yi Tom passed away when the children were young. Mama Suhu supported her family by operating a restaurant in Oxnard.
I think she probably came in the 1910 to 1915 category, because after all of us were born here, and she was what you call mail order bride.
A lot of the Chinese would come over and said, Mama Suhu knows how to cook very well,
Our friends and customers called her the General. If she gave an order, you were supposed to obey it.
We were crossing Oxnard Boulevard to go to this restaurant, and this man crosses the street in the middle of Oxnard Boulevard, and it was Bill Suhu. He extended a hand to us, and we stopped in the middle of the road, and we said, well, let's get off this road and talk.
And Bill called me back up a few weeks later and said, I had a hard time finding you. Yeah. And I says, I don't really remember who you are. But after he explained himself and everything and said, I remember one of the conversation was the fact that he would say, I'm the mayor of Oxnard, and I also own a Chinese restaurant. Well, only a Chinese restaurant, I believe. A mayor of Oxnard. I thought, yeah, and I'm the Queen of Sheba. When he first came back from the Army, he wanted to live at North Oxnard. And he was told by the mayor at that time that you can't live there. We have a yellow dog clause that doesn't allow Oriental. You could buy there, but you can't live there. And so he says, and I could fight for the United States Army, die there, but I can't live here, you know. And so he says, well, I hope one of these days I'll be able to change it. And that's when he really became interested in politics.
Bill became the mayor of Oxnard in 1966. He was the first Chinese mayor in California.
For Bill Suhu to be elected, he has to be appealing to the broader population. So for a Chinese person who only less than 50 years ago were essentially driven out of Ventura and deemed a pest or a parasite to the host community, and then for one of them to turn around and be the leader of the community is an incredible turnaround.
Bill Suhu's legacy to the city of Oxnard was that he was a trailblazer. He was one of the first minorities who was ever elected to the city council, and certainly when he was elected mayor, it was a great accomplishment. He was the first Chinese American to be elected mayor of any city in the country, and he was a very, very forceful person. He was able to articulate his positions very, very well. He loved people, people loved him, so he was able to sell his ideas.
And in 1966 or 67, I read an article in the newspaper, the local Oxnard newspaper, because I was living in Oxnard at that time, about the Camarillo Mental Hospital. There was a man there, and it's so sad, there was a man there of Chinese ancestry that was put into the Camarillo State Mental Hospital for over 10 years. And there was nothing wrong with him. It's just that there was no one that could speak his particular dialect in Chinese. So he was put in the mental ward, and that really caused me to say, we have to have a place for the older Chinese American to go to participate.
When I first came in 1970, we had some very local Toisan Chinese, and they would belong to Bing Gong Tong. And for me, at that time, I was a newcomer, being Mandarin speaking. And I was able to do some bridging work, and we thought about get together. At the early time, we had these potluck dinners, and together, all the Chinese together, and there was a full running of the Ventura County Chinese American Club.
So I thought, well, the club it's great. It's for people like us, but people like the younger people, we can survive with or without a club. But the older people need some type of identity with one another, and it's lonely to be of Asian and Chinese ancestry in Ventura County and not have friends. So I decided, oh, we need a club. So we all got together and we formed this Ventura County Chinese American Club back in, I think it was like 1970. And then we also formed a Chinese school with the club.
Today, the Chinese community in Ventura County is strong. The Ventura County Chinese American Association was formed in 1970. It's a cultural association that bridges old and new generations of Asian Americans and helps to maintain traditions. They have cultural nights, picnics, a Chinese dance group, a lion dance troupe, and a Chinese school. In 2000, the Ventura County Chinese American Historical Society was formed in conjunction with the VCCAA.
I think there's another important element, which is to let the younger people know here not only the younger generation from the Chinese American family hopefully can extend it to any family, that there's a wonderful culture which can enrich or bridge or cooperate or work with the Western culture, hopefully to have a better world in the future.
By looking back and showing the history of their struggle of the early pioneers, we appreciate how easy we have it. We need to pay tribute to those who went before us, because without them, we would have been facing the same hostility as they did. And also, I believe that this is not just the story of the Chinese. It's the story of all immigrants coming to America.
Being in the United States, it's a real delight. I've been around the world a few times, and I really have to say, you know, this is the place to live. There's opportunity galore, you know. And I say there's a mixture of people, and if everybody is tolerant and everybody looks at it, you do, you know, see that you could really blend in and be of a help.
United States is the best country in the world at this time to live, to work, and it has a legal system that's the best, even though it's not flawless. So if anyone wants to live and work in this country, I think they have found the best country to do that.
The community really should be one. I hope one day we don't even need to say American Chinese, Chinese American. Really, this is a matter of transition. Now that we have so many non-Chinese interested in Chinese cultures, and of course the Chinese people being in this society, we should be very much involved with the local community.
We must pay back to the community for what we get from the community. So I look at my father as the role model. He has done a lot, and I have achieved maybe a fraction of what he has done. I'm still very happy to have at least followed as much as possible in his footsteps. And I continue to try to do more for the community.
The first thing is to decide what kind of field you want to get in. Really, you have to follow your heart, do what you like most. It's not to be told by parents or by peers or what can make money, what you should do, a better future and all that. I think important is all the children should be given chance to follow their heart, to find their own real interests. That's most important.
You can have nothing and make something of yourself because of the system we have in place. And being Chinese American, every little inch that we go forth that has never been tread before not only reflects on yourself, but reflects on the Chinese community and how we can contribute as Americans to our nation. And I think that's very important.
I believe what makes this country great are the immigrants. They inject new ideas, work ethics, and also they pave the economic growth of this country. Without new ideas, without new energy, this country will stagnate and will regress. So I believe telling the history of the Chinese is not only inspiration to the people who came from China many, many years ago. It's an inspiration for all of us now to move forward, to be more tolerant, to be more acceptant of people who want to join us in this great country.